I am the Forest Health Extension Specialist, and a lot of the things that I work with and talk about are the things that can negatively impact our trees and our natural areas. And today we're going to be talking about invasive plants a little bit, which are one of those forest health threats, right? They are all over the place. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what those invasive plants are, why are they a problem, and what you can be doing about them. So that's my plan. And if you have any questions, do keep those and put those in the chat, and we will try to address those afterwards. So I want to start out with talking about what an invasive plant is, because I think this is something that's a little tricky, and it'll help to have a common definition of us in the group here as we're going forward. When I'm talking about invasive plants, and we're going to be talking about invasive trees in particular in this session, invasive shrubs if we get to it, what I'm talking about are things that are not from here. They're not native to our area. They're from some other part of the world. So they were introduced, and they are a big problem. They're causing some kind of negative impact that we don't like. That could be economic, it could be ecological in our natural areas. There's no kind of one size fits all approach. And that is a little bit subjective, because someone might say, well, that plant has pretty flowers and I like it. But that doesn't mean that it's not a problem in our natural areas. And for the most part, these are plants that can take over. If they just stayed put and didn't do anything, we wouldn't really care about them. They would be non-native, introduced, but not a big problem. Most invasive plants can take over really rapidly and prevent other plants from being successful, and that's why we don't like them. So just to give you an example of some of these things, these are two up and coming invasive plants in our area. Lesser celandine, which is a type of buttercup here, a spring ephemeral that, it's pretty. It's got these pretty yellow flowers, and nonetheless is an invasive threat. It's something that not only do you not want in your yard because it will cause problems there, it does not play nice and stay put, but takes over. But when it gets, and it will get out into other areas, it can just take them over. And here's another one, purple loosestrife, an invasive plant that's really common in those wet areas. This is one that whenever it's in bloom, people might see it and be like, wow, that's beautiful. I love that purple plant. But it's important to recognize that just because they're pretty does not mean they aren't invasive as well. So that's, I think, a key thing to think about with invasive plants. So another example of this is an invasive tree. We're talking invasive trees today that has been taking over in much of Kentucky, and that is Callery pear. So you might be familiar with these flowering pear cultivars. There are lots of them. They are broadly planted in our landscapes and urban areas. So if you've seen, or you might have, a flowering pear planted in your yard, they're all of the same species, Callery pear, but lots of different cultivars out there. And, when they were first really promoted a while back, they were promoted as sterile, so the seeds would not be reproductive. And he's got pretty flowers, people like them, but there's a number of reasons why the most popular cultivar, the Bradford pear, and again, there are others, but let's talk about Bradford pear, is not a great choice for your home landscape. It's not going to be a long-lived tree. It's going to fall apart. You can find better options than that. But in addition to just not being the best tree for our climate, and for long term, those seeds are not actually sterile. So maybe a Bradford pear is sterile with a Bradford pear, but remember, there are lots of different Callery pears that are out there. Those seeds are viable and they spread. So instead of just having the Callery pear here on the street or in your yard, you now have old fields that are filled with them. And you might not see it other than in the spring, when all of a sudden those fields and sides of the roads turn white with the flowers of that Callery pear. And what it's doing there is it's kind of choking things up, right? You've got this invasive plant that is taking over and preventing your native plants from thriving there. This time of year, you're not going to see the white flowers. That's a spring thing. But what you will see is the deep kind of purplish red fall color of Callery pear. And once you start looking for it, it is everywhere. It is amazing how rapidly this plant has colonized our natural areas. It's gone from that landscape, does not stay put, and moves out from there. And so you may be asking yourself, well, what's the big deal? Why do we really care about this? The cat's out of the bag with that one. Callery pear is everywhere. Why do we think that invasive plants are a problem? Because remember, I mentioned that the definition of an invasive species is two things: not native and it's a problem. So why do we think invasive plants are a problem? And it really depends. Every invasive plant is different, but in general, some of the key features and commonalities of invasive plants is that they hurt our native plant communities. So that is, they can outcompete other species and grow really densely. So imagine you have a really dense sea of Callery pear where nothing else is going to really be getting through there because it's growing so fast and so densely. And that can decrease the diversity of different native plants that are present that you want to be seeing. So you want to see spring wildflowers, and you want to see different shrubs and tree seedlings that are growing. And that's not going to happen if you just have this thick blanket of an invasive plant that's crowding things out and shading them out and preventing them from establishing there. And I think another really key thing is that we want these spaces to be kind of sustainable into the long term. We want to see plants replacing themselves when they're gone. And how can a tree seedling that's growing in here, how can it get up through here and get light and get nutrients and get what it needs if it's got, in this case, a thick blanket of bush honeysuckle, which is another invasive plant that's really common in our area. Here you can see it in the kind of late winter, early spring. It's one of the first things to leaf out and the last to lose its leaves. So it's got a competitive advantage over our native plants. And it's going to be, much lower diversity of different plant species in here than it would be if it was not invaded by this bush honeysuckle. Not much is going to make it through there, and you're not going to get growth of trees. Let's say that these overstory trees die. In this case, they're killed by the emerald ash borer, which is another invasive species that's caused all sorts of problems in our state. If they die, then you want to see other trees taking their place. Any of the other great native trees we have, our oaks, our hickories, you name it. But that's not going to happen if you just have this sea of invasive plants. So another reason why we might not want invasive plants and want to discourage them is that they can impact both pollinators and wildlife. So this is a beautiful native butterfly, the spicebush swallowtail, and it just grows on spicebush, which is a native shrub that might be growing there if it wasn't filled with bush honeysuckle. But the real problem here isn't that, our invasives are inherently bad for all wildlife. No, some wildlife like some species and others, might benefit from other species. But what you really want is a diversity of different plant species that can support a diversity of wildlife, of insects, of animals. And if instead you have just a few species, those invasives dominating everything, you're going to have supporting a reduced diversity of pollinators and wildlife. In addition to both of those things, invasive species can have big negative impacts in agriculture and forestry, and of course for your recreational activities. How can you get out and enjoy these spaces if they are filled with dense thickets of invasive shrubs or invasive trees that have huge thorns on them? That's a lot harder to do. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that many of the invasive plants that I've just been talking about have been tied to human health as well. So if you think of something like Lyme disease and the ticks that vector it, it's been found that invasion by bush honeysuckle and other invasive plants can actually promote the incidence of Lyme disease. And if you manage those things, you get less of that. So there are other ways that invasives can impact us, but those are just a few that I wanted to mention before we get started. A few other kind of housekeeping terms in terms of the terminology that we use. I mentioned that kind of one of the key things about being invasive is that it's non-native and we don't like it. Those two things. It's non-native and it's causing problems. But non-native just by itself does not mean bad. It just means that it wasn't from here. It came from some other part of the world originally. Most of our agricultural crops and many of our valued ornamental species are non-native. Now that doesn't mean that they're a problem. That means that they came from some other part of the world, but we value them and the things they provide, whether it's, crops like this apple tree here or ornamental trees like this ginkgo. There's a lot of benefit that those can provide as well. Now, the difference being that those non-natives do not become invasive. And at no point do we think that they're going to become invasive or that their net benefit really outweighs the potential negatives there. On the flip side, native does not always mean desirable. There are lots of native species that we might call weeds that you might want to get rid of, whether it's in your backyard or your woods, for a variety of reasons. Just a few that immediately come to mind to me would be this one here on the left. Does anyone recognize it or know what it is? This time of year, it has beautiful fall color, and it's a wildlife species. And it's a perfectly normal part of our natural ecosystems. Nonetheless, I don't think anyone's out there trying to plant poison ivy. If you are, good for you. But there are other reasons why we might not desire it that have nothing to do with the fact that it's native. Similarly, a lot of people in the woodland context might get rid of their wild grape, not invasive wild grape, but just our native wild grape, because it can have some negative impacts to trees. Weeds are a plant out of place and they can come in all sorts of different native and non-native statuses. And native doesn't necessarily mean they won't become really dominant and take over, especially if we're talking about in your yard. Now, they're unlikely to take over an entire forested area. That's something that our invasive plants really do. But if we're talking about small spaces, those might not be the right fits for some of our great native species like river cane or sumac, which are wonderful but will grow clonally and take over. And then one other thing, invasive doesn't mean that a plant is totally without value. I see this come up a lot in that people, get overwhelmed by the threats that invasives pose and recognize that it's not all negative. These aren't evil plants. They don't come at this with a mission to be bad in our natural areas. They are simply plants trying to get by. And for many of these are plants that were intentionally planted, intentionally brought to our country and spread because of positive attributes. In this picture here, I'm showing autumn olive, which is an invasive shrub. It can be really problematic, especially in disturbed areas, reclaimed mining sites, forests. It can take over and form really dense thickets that don't let other things in. At the same time, it was promoted for many years as a wildlife species. It produces all of these berries that even humans can eat. They're not that great. Maybe someone has a better recipe than I have, but it does have positive attributes. Its leaves have this interesting silvery sheen. The cover that's provided for them could be beneficial for some wildlife species. At the same time, since it was initially promoted, it also can grow in really poor soils. It can survive in places where other plants might not do as well. So it was promoted for a lot of different reasons. But since then, hindsight is 2020, and we have discovered, it grows a little too well in some of those places, right? So just because it was good at doing those things does not mean those positives outweigh the negatives that it causes in those natural areas. So something I just wanted to mention there, I'm not saying that invasive plants are inherently bad plants, but they are not team players, right? They do not play well with others. They tend to take over our natural areas and prevent the native plants from thriving in the way that we want to support other species. Even if this is something that starts in your yard, in your garden, it can move out from there and they don't stay put, unfortunately. So that's why, today we're going to be talking a little bit about invasive trees to avoid, because you don't want to be that seed source that's going to spread this invasive plant elsewhere. And for many of these, there are better choices for your landscape that you're going to be happier with. And we'll talk about those native alternatives. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of these common invasive trees, not all of them, but many of the invasive trees that are issues in our area, how you might go about managing them, and some great native alternatives to those species. So if we get time at the end, we might also cover some shrubs as well. So a few invasive trees to avoid. The first is a tree that is everywhere, and it has the misnomer of being tree of heaven, which I'm sure those of you that have encountered it feel it does not live up to this heavenly name. But you can see its leaves here. It has these kind of long compound leaves. You might confuse it with some of our native trees like a walnut or a sumac, with many leaflets on an individual leaf. And I think really striking is when it produces its seeds. They have this beautiful light green pink color, and you can see that one little cluster of seeds, the seed is in the middle and it's got this papery sheath around it, produces tons of seeds. And those seeds can spread through the wind to new spots. And this is a plant that really likes disturbed areas, and it can thrive in poor quality sites. It will take advantage of any disturbance to the soil, and if it gets there before your natives are able to establish, it can take over and form dense thickets. In addition to spreading by seed, it will grow clonally through the ground, and you'll have lots of shoots of tree of heaven coming up. While it can grow quite large, you'll also see a lot of kind of smaller tree of heaven on the side of the road and all around. This is one that you will see really commonly in urban areas. If you've got a train running like near you, there's probably some on the side of those train tracks. But it's also a big problem in our forested areas and natural areas. If you have tree of heaven in there, if you have some disturbance, which happens naturally, be it some weather related disturbance, you've got a tornado or an ice storm that comes in, it could be an invasive insect like the emerald ash borer coming in and killing trees. It could be just a harvest that's taking place and you have tree of heaven in there. What you're going to get back is a sea of tree of heaven and not the diversity of native species that you want. Now, tree of heaven, no one is out there intentionally planting tree of heaven, or at least I certainly hope not. It is not a tree that you would find for sale or seek out. But the other species I'm going to talk about are some trees that you might see for sale places. And I'm here to tell you, I think you can do better. You can find native trees that are going to be much better, and non-invasive, non-native trees that are going to be much better in your landscape than these upcoming invasives. They might have some cool things about them, but in the long term, you're going to be happier with a tree that's going to perform better and be longer lived, as well as not spread out into your yard and take it over, but also in natural areas. So a few of those would be things like mimosa. How many of you have seen these flowering in the summertime? They look like a tree that Dr. Seuss made, in my opinion. They've got these kind of feathery flowers with outrageous pink color, really attractive flowers, and they flower at a time when you're not seeing a lot of other things flower. They're a smaller tree and are really common in roadsides and disturbed areas. They also produce they're in the pea family, and they produce these kind of long bean pod like seeds. And you will well know when you have one mimosa in your yard, you will rapidly have more mimosas in your yard, because they will spread from there. And they might look pretty for that brief window of time when they're flowering, but I think for the rest of the time, they're kind of a messy tree. They're not as attractive, and certainly something that we can find some great alternatives to. Now, you will find some cultivars of mimosa that are available for sale, including one that is even more outrageously colored with purple leaves and pink flowers, that is supposedly not as invasive. So I like that. It's also not going to be quite as hardy and might not be a good fit for other reasons. But before you buy that, make sure to check out some of these great other trees that we're going to talk about in a moment. Another invasive plant that you might be tempted by when it's flowering is Paulownia. This is also called princess tree or empress tree. It goes by many names. And as you can see in this picture, the leaves are huge. It has huge leaves and it grows really, really fast. And for that reason, it's been promoted and is still being promoted by various groups, as a species that will grow fast and something that should be planted. I'm here to say you don't need to do that, because we have lots of great native tree species that are already growing here and grow rapidly, and are going to be really valuable long term, versus Paulownia, which is a non-native invasive species, that is not going to be valuable long term, is not going to be a long-lived, really valuable species for us, whether we're talking about timber or just wildlife value there. And there are better choices. But when you see it blooming, and it's kind of one of the earliest things to bloom, and it's got these beautiful purplish flowers, you might think, what is that beautiful plant? But what you wouldn't necessarily see, and some of the reasons why it's such a problem in our natural areas, is that those flowers produce tons and tons and tons of seeds. Lots of these little papery seeds that are held within these pods that will then spread in the air. And if they come into contact with especially disturbed areas and edges, they can rapidly take those over and grow really fast, outcompete native species. So here I am standing next to 1 year's growth of this Paulownia. And so you can see just how fast it's growing and how quickly it could grow faster than some of the trees that you might want to see there. So where you might prefer to see oaks growing in our forests and natural areas, if instead you have a sea of this kind of junk of Paulownia, not something that you want, and not something you want to be promoting by having it in your yard even. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier Callery pear and showed you those photos of it invading in those natural areas. So Callery pear being the general name, the species, for the many different cultivars of flowering pear. So there's lots of them. There's Bradford, there's Aristocrat, there's Chanticleer. But when they naturalize and spread into natural areas, we tend to call them Callery pear, and they get a different form. As you can see in this picture, they're super dense, more of a thicket, and they have long thorns that can be an issue as well. Not that we don't have native species that have thorns too, but you're not going to be able to get through your old field that's transitioning into a forest if it's all Callery pear. It's going to be a painful process, and you're not going to see the diversity of other species that you want. In addition to the fact that those flowering pear trees really do fall apart fast in your landscape setting. They drop branches. Anytime we have a major weather event, there's going to be a lot of failure, and you can do better than those in your home landscape. So when it comes to how to manage invasive plants and these invasive trees that we were just talking about, if you've got, even in your backyard, but certainly if you have more area than that, you've got to scout for them. You got to look for them, because it's a lot easier to pull up a little seedling like this than to try to cut down a large tree when it's already growing. And so that's something that I know one does in their garden and in their landscape, is getting rid of what doesn't go there. And I think just being aware of some of these invasives and managing them before they get out of control. Now, for anything that I just talked about, another consideration is that you don't want to be a source of seeds that are going to invade natural areas near you. And if you do have any of these trees that are in your woods or on your property and want to get rid of them, there are a variety of techniques for doing so. There's no one single approach for that. There are a lot of different options out there, and we'll discuss some of them. And it really depends on the species that you're dealing with, how big it is, what's the rest of the site like, and what do you prefer. But I will say a key component is typically killing the root systems of that tree. Because if you just cut it down, you might get it to sprout back even worse than it was. So finding some way to get rid of that whole root system, either maybe using a systemic herbicide, like in this picture, this person's doing a hack and squirt approach, where instead of having to go through all the work of cutting down the tree, they are hacking into it and spraying herbicide in there, or repeatedly removing any new shoot growth that comes up if you're cutting it down. I'm just keeping in mind that you've got to do that really regularly for a while. Otherwise, it's going to come back worse than it was, to pulling out those smaller trees and shrubs, getting that whole root system. And whatever you're doing, prevent arrival and reestablishment, because there's going to constantly be new seeds that are coming in. Many of the invasive species have seeds that are either spread on the wind and can travel long distances that way, or have seeds that are attractive to wildlife and spread that way. One of the invasive trees that I didn't mention earlier, but is a problem in our area, is white mulberry. And of course, I mean, who doesn't like to eat those mulberry fruits? Although I'll say I like the red mulberry, which is our native mulberry, better. But that's something that definitely an animal would take and eat and leave at a new location to spread it. So always kind of being aware that you're going to have to continue to look for it. You're never really done looking for invasive plants, but it becomes a lot less work when you're not dealing with the bigger trees, you're dealing with the smaller stuff. And of course, promoting the diversity of native species, because again, the message here is not that invasives are inherently terrible and worthless, right? It's just that you can do better. You can have a diversity of native species that support a diversity of insects and pollinators, that support a diversity of wildlife. That's really what we want, is diversity in a lot of these contexts. And if you're thinking, well, I don't really care about diversity, I just want to have a beautiful garden and a beautiful yard, you can do that as well as buffer yourself from any problems in the future. I think diversity is the key. Imagine we have something that comes in, that an invasive insect that kills all of your ash. Oh wait, we just had that with emerald ash borer. How about something that kills all of your maple? Oh wait, we've got that just north of us in Ohio, the Asian longhorn beetle. These things keep happening over and over again, where we have a new invasive that comes in and wipes something out. And if you've got diversity, if you have a diversity of different native species, you're not completely protected from that, but you are certainly buffered for it. So just something I wanted to suggest there. And if you have questions about kind of management of some of these things, for example, some different approaches to calorie repair for small trees versus large trees, you can put those in the chat. But there's lots of different options out there, and it depends. It depends on you, your preferences, and what you've got. Whether you're going to pull things up by hand, whether you're going to use a cut stump herbicide spray that'll be systemic and kill the root system, a foliar herbicide spray, basal bark, grazing, some combination of other types of management approaches. Now, once you get into those larger trees, however, there's a whole different suite suite of management approaches you might consider, like that hack and squirt spray I mentioned before. You could do cut it down followed by a foliar herbicide spray. You could cut or you could treat the cut stump with herbicide. If you were to just cut it, however, you might wind up with a lot of sprouts coming back. So something to just be aware of and to expect. If you expect that, you can deal with that and manage it better than if you're taken by surprise. So let's talk about some alternatives that are out there. So let's use the example of Callery pear, since we talked about it earlier, that flowering pear tree that not only is just an invasive, real nuisance and problem in our natural areas, but not the best fit for your landscapes. So what do people like about Callery pear? When I think about it, I think of it's got several nice attributes. It's got pretty spring flowers. Now, they are smelly. If you have lots of them, it's going to smell very gross. But they are attractive and it flowers early in the spring. It has pretty fall color right now. It's got a small size. These are, some of the characteristics that I think of when I think of the positives of those flowering pears. But there are other trees that provide many of those traits. And another thing I'd say is kind of right plant, right place. So this is just a general thing. When we're talking about these alternatives, there's no one perfect tree. There's no one replacement for Callery pear. It just depends. It depends on what you want. What do you want it to do? Where it's going to go? Is it going to go into a wetter area or a drier area? Is it going to be under power lines? Is it going to be close to your house? Those are all really important things to keep in mind, as well as what do you want? Do you want those early season flowers? Is that the thing that you want? Or do you want a tree that's going to be a big, beautiful shade tree in the future? Or do you just want something that's going to be no mess, nothing that you'll have to fool with there? One person's perfect tree might be somebody else's least favorite. For example, I have a persimmon growing in my yard. I love persimmons, and maybe someday I'll be the beneficiary of some fruit that'll form. It's still quite little, so we've got a ways to go. I would not recommend a persimmon to someone who doesn't want a messy tree, right? Those persimmons are going to be a little bit messy if they ever come in, and that's what I'm looking for. But if that's not what you're interested in, there are better choices for you out there. So there's no one perfect tree. Even what I'm going to be talking about today are just a bunch of different options. And I see in the chat we have a great option listed, serviceberry. Why, I think alike. Serviceberry is one of my favorite alternatives to Callery pear. Why? Well, it's got flowers. Look at these beautiful white flowers in the spring. It is small. And there are different species of serviceberry. There are different forms of it. You can get some that are more in this tree-like form. You can also get some that are multi-stemmed, are going to kind of have a different look. And I think that's one of the things as we start to talk about some of these alternatives is that there are many different, in some cases, species, in some cases, cultivars that are available that can give you different aspect. So there's more shopping to do, more perusing to do, to think about what you want. In addition, is that a good fit for you and your site? Another nice thing about serviceberry is that it does produce the berries, the small fruit that are not only appealing for wildlife, but humans as well. So another interest there, and just a beautiful alternative to Callery pear in my mind. Let's see if other folks have other suggestions and favorite trees, and we'll see if they're on my list or not. Feel free to put those in the chat if you like your favorites. Another one that I really love is maybe a really familiar tree to you, redbud. And these are trees. This is a native species that is everywhere. It is all over. And, some people might say, Oh, well, this is an invasive species because they can colonize and they can grow in, but it's a native species. So automatically we know it can't be an invasive species. It's a native species that is a normal part of our natural areas, in addition to the fact that it's a beautiful species and it's got a few things that make it a nice calorie pear alternative. It's a smaller tree. Now you can get some cultivars and some types that are going to grow larger and some that are going to grow smaller. But in general, it's a smaller size and it's got gorgeous flowers. I mean, look at these beautiful pink flowers here, just covered with them. And those do develop into seeds, seed pods. I personally like the look of those seed pods and think they have a pretty aesthetic as well. You're welcome to tell me I'm wrong in the chat, but I think that also kind of adds to their appeal for me. Although those will come up in your yard, they're not something that's going to take over a natural area and cause problems in the future, like your Callery pear would. A few other things to note about redbud. While you might have heard of redbud and be totally familiar with it, what you might not be familiar with are the many excellent cultivars that are available commercially for redbud. So there's everything from this Appalachian redbud that's got kind of more of a red pink than a traditional kind of purplish color of those flowers. You've got a vanilla twist weeping redbud that has actually white flowers. You've got variegated varieties like this silver cloud here where the foliage is white, and many, many more. And I think this is just kind of the first example of, just because I'm telling you about a native tree species that you might have heard of before, does not mean that there aren't all sorts of exciting things happening in different cultivars available that might be a really good fit for what you're looking for in your landscape, in addition to the fact that this is a native species. So just wanted to mention some of those great redbuds out there. And if you have a favorite redbud cultivar, put it in the chat and tell us about it. Another one kind of along the same lines would be our flowering dogwood. And I said flowering dogwood, and there's a species, Cornus florida, that is flowering dogwood, but there are actually a lot of different flowering dogwood species out there, native and non-native, and as well as some dogwood species that would have a different flower than we tend to think of, but would also be great choices for your landscape. And kind of just looking at these flowers right here, these big showy white bracts that we all know and love from dogwood in the spring, flowering, really appealing. But there are lots of different cultivars of dogwood out there. So one of the big problems for flowering dogwood in our landscapes is a disease, anthracnose, that can impact it. But there are cultivars of our native dogwood, like the Appalachian spring, that are resistant to that anthracnose, faster growing. There are cultivars that have different traits and hybrids that could be a really great choice. In addition, I think dogwood is one of those where if it may or may not be the right tree for the site that you have, depending on sun and moisture levels, but just really breathtaking. In my mind, one of those classic trees of the spring, and another wonderful small flowering tree that's a great replacement for a Callery pear. Another species that I think is going to be less known than any of the ones I've mentioned so far is a red buckeye. So we have buckeyes that are present right here throughout Kentucky, Ohio buckeye and yellow buckeye. Now this is different. It is a buckeye and it's native to North America, but it's a different buckeye species. And this one's going to have a smaller form and has these really interesting and weird red pink flowers that I think are just beautiful. A really gorgeous specimen tree that's going to be unusual and different. And if you're looking for a pop of something weird, if you're thinking of that mimosa and its outrageous flowers, this is one that will give it a run for its money with, really beautiful flowers too. Now, not to say that this is a perfect tree in every way. Like all of our native buckeyes, their foliage doesn't last through the summer, and they're gonna kind of lose that a little earlier than any of your other tree species. But a really cool tree that I think is underused, and another one to consider. But one thing that I've noticed is that when I talk with people about their Callery pear and in replacing their Bradford pear, and one of the things that we've been trying to do is to help people get rid of their Callery pear and their landscape flowering pear trees, is that sometimes they want a one for one replacement. The Callery pear was like this, and they want a tree that's kind of like that. Sometimes what they want is something totally different, though. So they might have had a Bradford pear there, but that doesn't mean that that's what they want long term. Maybe they want something that's a little larger. Maybe they want more of a shade tree than that Callery pear was. And so, one that I'd really recommend for somebody who wants that beautiful fall color, but maybe wants more of a larger tree, would be black gum. If you haven't heard of this, I'm sure you will in the future. It's kind of a up and coming landscape tree, I'd say, and that you'll see it used a lot more. But it's a native tree species to our region, and it's just got really breathtakingly beautiful fall color, but it also just grows really nicely. It's got a nice form, and is a great selection for landscape settings. Now, you'll see a lot of you might see sweet gum a lot in the landscape setting. This is different. This is black gum, but a beautiful species that I think is underused and one that you could consider. Another just gorgeous, smaller tree, not as small as some of the ones we talked about earlier, but in that medium size would be yellowwood. Really beautiful branching on this one. As you can see in this picture, it's got a really nice V-shaped growth there, kind of like an umbrella shape that it grows out in. And as you can see, can have some very nice fall color, as well as really beautiful white flowers. So this is one that'll give you the flowers, the smaller size, and that beautiful fall color. Love yellowwood is a gorgeous species for landscapes and is underplanted as well. Another kind of nice tree that might fall under or beneath your radar for some of these smaller potential replacements to Callery pear would be American hornbeam. And it's going to be a little smaller. It's got great fall color. And this is another one, as with many of the species I've mentioned, that there are some really interesting cultivars out there. So, this is a picture of the native flame cultivar of American hornbeam that's got a more upright growth form and really pretty fall color. Here's another cultivar of hornbeam, ball of fire, which is more compact and rounded. It's got more of an orangey fall color. Lots of options out there. Another great smaller beautiful native tree, and there are several in this group of viburnums, but is rusty blackhaw. It's got a smaller size, it's got really pretty flowers when it's in bloom, and beautiful fall color as well. So, as you can see, lots of boxes being checked here by that. Now, one of my personal favorites, and I couldn't make this list without including it, is pawpaw. Now, you can see here from this photo, it doesn't necessarily have that perfect tree form. A lot of times it'll be more of a thicket or kind of multi-stemmed growing of pawpaw, although you can train it into that single tree if that's what you want. It can also be a nice kind of more mass of pawpaw growing. And I think, of course, the reason everyone knows pawpaw is for its fruit. It produces pawpaws, which, if you haven't tried them before, are really great and our largest fruit native to North America. But it grows really rapidly. It can grow densely in areas. It's a smaller tree that can tolerate a range of different sites and conditions. And I think just thrive in natural areas as well as in your yard. So another great one to include. I see Carolina silver bell was one of the ones that came up in the chat about other native trees that are great, smaller trees, beautiful white flowers, and that Carolina silver bell. And I've seen some really great specimens of that as well. Another good choice. And again, there are so many different ones. And in this picture here, you've got an oak tree. In no way, shape, or form is an oak tree a replacement for a Callery pear, right? If you think about them, they're like totally different trees. An oak tree will never produce flowers like that. It produces flowers, but not the kind of really attractive ones that you might see. You wouldn't notice them in the same way. It's going to be a large shade tree versus that smaller stature, and it's going to produce lots of acorns. And so you'd think, why did I include this picture at the end? And again, that's because as I've been talking with people about their Callery pear and their other invasive trees, sometimes what was initially planted there is not your vision for that spot long term. I've had several people tell me, oh, I cut down my Callery pear. What should I plant? I really want a large shade tree that's going to live for a long time. It's like, well, you might be looking at totally different species that are nothing that we talked about today, but not that there aren't some fantastic replacements for that Callery pear that might look totally different. And, we're so lucky here in that we have so many different trees to choose from. You really can't do better than an oak tree, though, when it comes to a tree that's going to be long-lived and it's going to support a diversity of insects that will support other wildlife in your yard as well. Before we wrap up and take any questions, is of course, for everything that I talked about, when I mentioned right plant, right place, your local extension office is going to be the best place to start. You've got a county agent who's going to be really familiar with your area and give you ideas of what might be a good option for you. I cannot speak highly enough of the expertise that your county agents provide. So make sure, if you don't know them already, you reach out and get to know them well. In addition, I wanted to mention the Kentucky Invasive Plant Council. They're a great source for different information on invasive plants. They actually have this guide, Kentucky's Native Alternatives to Invasive Plants, that lists the species I mentioned plus a lot of others as replacements for potential invasive plants. And the Kentucky Native Plant Society right here, if you check them out, you will go to their website, and you'll find they have a list of different retailers and companies that specialize in native plants that could be a good fit for you. I also want to mention some of the plants that I mentioned were drawn from the Theodore Klein Plant Award list that I was recommended to by Kelly Jackson, who's one of your fantastic county agents and is on today. He pointed me to this great award that goes through and highlights different plants. And there's also a lot of local expertise in your local groups, whether it's Wild Ones or other local gardening organizations and local retailers and nurseries. And if they don't have native plants or if they have invasive plants, could be a great opportunity to chat with them more about that. A lot of those local retailers have a lot of expertise and could share that with you. So, with that, I want to open it up for any questions and also encourage you to check out KY Forest Health, Kentucky Forest Health, for more information on invasive plants and their management.